It'll be fresher than yesterday and a bit less blustery.
A bright start and always a warm welcome. Qatar Airways sponsors the weather.
It's the end of the first year of Sir Keir Starmer's Labour administration. It's school report time. In the old days, you could conveniently lose the envelope in the high street in the hope that your parents wouldn't bother to check with your teachers. Now, what with email and the rest of it, there is no escape. Everybody knows that you definitely could do better. Last July, the Prime Minister passed his first big test with flying colours, basking in a general election triumph. There were A-stars all around, glittering careers to follow. Change was in the air. 12 months later, there's change, all right. Cuts, rebellions, catastrophic polling figures. Can he fix it? Maybe, but his party's calling for some serious revision of the Labour team. Well, it's been a rough old year for the government. Can things only get better for Starmer's Labour? The Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, joins us this morning. Here for the Conservatives is Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride. A year on from their crushing defeat, is reform now well and truly feasting on their remains? And could a new party led by Jeremy Corbyn pose a similar threat to Labour? Lord Kinnock brought the party back from the brink in the 80s. We'll see what he makes of their challenges today. Plus, 20 years to the day since London was awarded the Olympics. We'll assess their legacy with the man who organised them, World Athletics President Lord Sebastian Coe. And with us all morning, the former Labour Communications Director Tom Baldwin, broadcaster Daisy McAndrew, and the Downing Street Communications Director under Boris Johnson, Guto Harry. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. As he surveys the wreckage of his first year in office this morning, the Prime Minister can take a crumb of comfort from this thought. History is on his side. The British are a famously tolerant people, including of their own governments. We believe in handing out second chances. And since the Second World War, we've only once turfed a first-term administration out of office. The exception was the Conservative administration elected in 1970. 4 years later, after rises in unemployment, inflation and oil prices, the imposition of a 3-day working week and 2 disastrous miners' strikes, Prime Minister Edward Heath asked the electorate, "Who rules Britain?" They replied, "Well, we're not that bothered as long as it's not you." It's been a catastrophic week for Sir Keir. His welfare reform bill was gutted by his own backbenchers. Record numbers of illegal migrants crossed the Channel. The money markets had the wobbles. And his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, is threatening to launch a new party to his left. He can only look across the Atlantic in envy, where the president, on whom Labour leaders poured scorn before they became his best friends, got his big, beautiful economic plan through Congress, brought crossings at the southern border down by 90%, and looks to be in touching distance of engineering a temporary ceasefire in Gaza. But hey, the next general election may be more than 3 years away, and given the pace at which politics moves these days, that's a lifetime. And Sir Keir won't be short on great advice on how to fix his problems, starting right here, right now. Well, as you could tell from our change in studio, it's a slightly different look to this programme this morning. We'll hear from the government a little later, but first I can speak to the man who led Labour for 9 years through 2 general elections. Lord Kinnock. Good morning, Neil.
Good morning, Trevor. I'm just still giggling over me being advisor. Yes, quite. Right.
Top-class advice.
Oh, yeah. It may be top-class advice, but it's never offered and never taken. So.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, we will see. Yeah. Look, a year ago, Labour celebrated this really stonking victory, had a massive majority. This week, it feels like a mess. What's gone wrong?
It's not a mess, but what's gone wrong is really the lack of a narrative, a story of the objectives of the government and why they're working towards it and how they're working towards it. Now, they are working towards it with a series of really commendable and absolutely essential policies. They are barely noticed because they're obscured by all the song and dance and noise, drums banging and cymbals clashing of the winter fuel payment being massively reduced and then restored, the welfare programme, the 2-child benefit cap, and the cuts in development aid, all those negative things that really are heartily disliked across the Labour movement and more widely, much more widely. And that means that apart from the distaste for undertaking those policies, the cloud hangs over the accomplishments of the government, which are substantial and will become greater, and people are not getting the message. So they've got to change in terms of focusing on accomplishment and communicating the accomplishment.
Well, you've mentioned a number of things there, but the central point you're making is that there isn't a clear message from government. Now, I'm old enough to remember that under your leadership of the Labour Party, I can probably sum it up pretty quickly now. First thing, we're not mad anymore. Right. And number 2, we're going to get rid of extremists. And number 3, we are the party of social justice against the Thatcherite Tories who are going to do all sorts...
Social justice and economic efficiency.
There you go.
That's the phrase that I coined.
Why haven't we got as clear a message from this Labour administration?
Partly because of the circumstances in which they had to operate, necessarily, in order to get elected. They put an emphasis on caution and discipline, which was crucial in the wake of the chaos that had gone before under Corbyn. And they really did restore credibility and respect for the Labour Party, but it did mean that they depressed expectations and limited themselves by saying they were going to rigidly stick to fiscal rules and that they weren't going to substantially or indeed increase, quote, quote, taxes on working people at all. Now, that means that unless you are looking for other original sources of revenue in order to invest in public services and long-term investment, then you are really jammed in a bit of a corner.
I get the point about discipline, but they came in, they had this huge majority. They've had essentially no challenge. The opposition is divided, and they would have room to, if you like, be a little bit more flexible. Do you think that they should think again about what people say is boxing themselves in with the fiscal rules?
I think if you were sitting at the cabinet table and offered the words you've just used, you would find a ready hearing. Because people are willing, and have been for some time, naturally, because they're pragmatic politicians, as well as people with convictions and strong values. They are listening to the ideas of adjustment and alternative. There's no question at all about that.
So if you were, but far more likely scenario, you were sitting at the cabinet table, you would say, look, everybody, I know that discipline matters, but is it time to think again about chaining ourselves to this mantra?
Well, I said a couple of years ago, in actually defending the caution of the opposition, led brilliantly, in my view, by Keir Starmer. And it was that the essential disciplined caution of opposition won't be allowed to become stiffness or stagnation in government. Now, unfortunately, the appearance has been given, it's not actually the accurate picture, but the appearance has been given that they have bogged down by their own imposed limitations. There are ways around that, ways out of it, pathways that I think people are willing to explore and actually would commend themselves to the great majority of the general public. They include, for instance, asset taxes in a period in which, for the last 20-odd years, in the United Kingdom, like quite a lot of other Western economies, earned incomes have stagnated in real terms, while asset values have zoomed. They've just gone through the roof.
Houses,
and
stocks
they've been
and shares, all of that.
Barely touched, absolutely. And they've been barely touched. Now, you wouldn't have to touch assets of under 6 or 7 million, so people's houses would be secure, obviously. But even by going for an imposition of 2% on asset values above 10 million, say, which is a very big fortune, the government would be in a position to collect 10 or 11 billion a year. Now, it's not going to pay all the bills, but it does two things, or that kind of levy does two things. One is to secure resources, which is very important, revenues. But the second thing it does is to say to the country, we are the government of equity. And this is a country which is very substantially fed up with the fact that whatever happens in the world, whatever happens in the UK, the same interests come out on top, unscathed all the time, while everybody else is paying more for gutted services. Now, I think that a gesture, or a substantial gesture, in the direction of equity, fairness, would make a big difference.
So two things. You think that when Rachel Reeves comes to present her budget in the autumn, number one, she should contemplate tax rises. And secondly, you would say tax rises on wealth and assets.
Yes, I would, because I think they should stick to the fiscal rules they've established as a way of strong reassurance about their commitment. It's very, very, very important, not just for the public, but for the markets too, and indeed for their own self-confidence, which is very important.
But isn't the problem here, because you had to confront this yourself, that the markets and to some extent the electorate are more suspicious of Labour's propensity to tax and spend?
Yes.
And maybe there's something to be said for having bent over backwards to demonstrate, as Rachel Reeves obviously did, that there is no circumstance in which Labour governments would do what they're reputed to do, which is to promise the earth and then make you pay for it.
OK, to start with, they didn't promise the earth. And they're actually making substantial gains with record public investment commitments and the biggest ever commitment of resources, for instance, to the National Health Service, which is starting, even after a year, to have a significant effect. Now, the important thing is that if you're going to make an increase in taxation, to explain in detail and repeatedly where it's coming from, and secondly, why it's being levied and where it's going to. Now, I'm certain, I know about the suspicion, which is a good discipline. Labour has got to accommodate this suspicion and say, look, we're being absolutely out front and we can demonstrate the veracity, the truth of the integrity of what we're saying by indicating to you in very strong and clear terms who we are taxing, what we're taxing, and why we're doing it, and where we're going to spend it. It's very, very important.
How serious a threat do you think a Corbyn-led party to the left of Labour is going to be?
Well, I understand they're having a bit of difficulty over thinking up a name. And I, in a comradely way, I'd suggest one. It would be the Farage Assistance Group. Because the reality is, and everybody knows it, a division in the anti-conservative, capital C or small c, anti-right-wing vote can only assist the parties of the right, the Conservatives especially now, under Mrs. Badenoch, and under Farage, the Reform Party. So the splintering, fragmentation, offered by a new party of the left, as they say, I've got my doubts about that, but of the left, can only be of assistance to the enemies of Labour, of the working class, the people who have no means of sustaining themselves other than the sale of their labour by hand and by brain, and can only be of benefit to the egos of those who are running such a party. And they haven't decided who should do that yet either.
Yes, well, this is a great history of ultra-left parties, isn't it? They splinter, but you did have to face yourself. You're famous for facing down the militant tendency.
Yeah.
And you took it seriously.
Yeah.
Should Starmer take this as seriously? I mean, he's been directing his fire at reform recently, but maybe he needs to look to his left as well.
Yes, I don't think Keir should worry himself too much about reform or about Corbyn, because he's the Prime Minister, he'd be punching down. But there are other people throughout the party who should be taking Corbyn and reform very seriously. One, because of the power of seepage of votes in crucial seats away from the Labour Party, which in our first past the post system is particularly damaging. And secondly, because reform and the Conservatives are the natural enemy of progressives in any case, and also sailing under false flags. I mean, here's Farage. A couple of weeks ago, Farage was down in South Wales saying he wanted to reopen the pits, coal mines, and that he wanted to restart the blast furnaces in Port Talbot Steelworks. Now, as it happens, totally by coincidence, when I was a student for 5 or 6 years, I worked in the steelworks. I worked on the blast furnaces. My father was a blast furnaceman. The idea of restarting a blast furnace is the other side of impossible. I mean, it's ridiculous. And reopening a coal mine would not just be perilous, it would be lethal. So either Farage knows that and is deliberately lying, or he doesn't know it and he's extremely stupid.
You called him the enemy. That's quite a strong term.
Oh, yeah, they are the enemy. Yeah.
In what way?
I mean, well, they're poseurs. I mean, you just got to look at them and listen to them to know that they're following the classic path of, first of all, finding and harvesting grievance, resentment, division. Then, secondly, finding someone to blame. It can be the metropolitan elite, so-called, but it can be other groupings in society, pointing the figures all the time. Then you have to offer very simplistic responses, never answers, to very complex problems. And then hope that people are so brassed off with the conditions in which they're living, and I'd say with some justification, that you can harvest that grievance, offer some culprits for electoral punishment, and backed up, for instance, by a kind of invented history that says there was a time when our country was great and feared and respected, and that's been sacrificed and sabotaged by the metropolitan elite and this group and that group. And you can then get people, not for the first time in history, to believe the glibness. Now, it's happened before, it can happen again, and we've got to prevent it. One of the ways
When you say before...
When it's happened before, it happened in Europe in the 1930s, in this country in the 1930s.
You're thinking about Mosley and...
Yeah, I'm not accusing Reform of being fascist. Of course, they're not that. But they are using, consciously or unconsciously, a similar playbook, and it's very dangerous.
Can I just ask you very quickly, last question. When you became leader of the Labour Party, the biggest challenge was you dealt with militant, but the SDP threatened to break the mould of British politics. One of the features of the current situation is that we now have 5 parties who are all, you know, between 10 and 25% of the vote. Do you think that the mould has finally been broken, that the Labour-Tory duopoly is over?
Yeah, I think it's quite probable, certainly for a period. I think that the organisational capability and the numbers that are still in the 2 main parties, and the fact that politics in every country is basically divided into broadly the left, broadly the right, and people who vary in their emphasis on the centre. Now, at the moment, that's represented in our country by 5 or even 6 parties, and it does mean that there's a certain bewilderment. One of the responses to that, I would make, of course, but it's not going to happen for a long time, is the introduction of a more proportional system of representation. It's not going to happen for a long time, but I've been campaigning for that for quite a time. But secondly, it also means that the large parties have got to make a direct appeal to re-establish their credentials with the mass of the population. I'm certain indeed, Labour can do that with achievement. High levels of public investment in the things that matter to people, the condition of their communities, the opportunities of their kids, and the health of themselves and their elderly people.
Neil Kinnock, thank you so much. We could talk all morning, but sadly, we've got to go on to some other people. Neil Kinnock, thank you so much for your time this morning.
OK, good to see you.
Now, in a moment, we'll hear from this morning's panel, the former Labour Communications Director, Tom Baldwin, the broadcaster, Daisy McAndrew, and the Downing Street Communications Director under Boris Johnson, Guto Harry. Plenty still to stick around for. We'll speak to the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride, at the top of the hour. Plus, we'll mark 20 years since London was awarded the Olympic and Paralympic Games with a mastermind behind them, World Athletics President Lord Coe. And as always, we'll hear from the government a little later than usual. The Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, joins us later. Well, a central part of the Education Secretary's brief is whether or not the government can afford to scrap the 2-child benefit cap, something which the electoral dysfunction team have been discussing on their latest episode.
It becomes financially, but also politically more difficult to abolish the 2-child benefit cap.
It's shelved.
Well, I think that it's more difficult for the government to look as though it's being pushed by the PLP to do it. So that looks like more political weakness. And financially, there's less money available to actually do it. So what a paradox that what's been done on this welfare bill has actually made it less easy to do what might well have been done in the autumn, which is deal with the two-child benefit cap. But I think although Rachel Reeves is in a very big hole and it's very difficult, she is also the solution to the problem.
But she's going to have to raise taxes, isn't she?
She has to. Unless she breaks her fiscal rules, which is the one thing that's keeping her credibility with the markets.
We are now utterly tipped into that territory, which I think is incredibly unfortunate, that we've got to be having the debate dominated now, between now and the budget, about tax raising.
Well, let's turn to our panel. We're joined all morning by former Communications Director Tom Baldwin, broadcaster Daisy McAndrew, and the former Downing Street Communications Director Guto Harry. Right, well, it is, as I said, school report time. Guto, how have they done?
Well, I think Neil Kinnock is a reminder of a Labour Party that worked extremely hard to go from oblivion to close to power. And, you know, I still feel for Neil that he was cheated of the spoils of that himself. But he did the heavy lifting for a Tony Blair government that came in with a great sense of drive, energy and purpose. Keir Starmer never did that. He basically focused on the faults of the Conservative Party and was aided here handsomely by the dysfunctionality of the Conservative Party at the time, in Parliament in particular. And so he won a general election by default, having not clarified to himself, I think, and to his team, not to mention to the British public, what they would do in office. And so they've been facing in different directions, and they've looked incoherent. And there are things we could all like, and then we hate them for not doing them or for doing them, and things that we all dislike, and we hate them for doing them or not doing them. And so they've ended up in a position where they've alienated the left, they've alienated the right, they've alarmed business, and, you know, the Chancellor is crying in the chamber, for which I have, you know, personal sympathy, but it's like an extraordinary metaphor for a year that's gone, you know, from hero to zero.
Daisy?
I think a lot of what Guto says is completely spot on. I mean, we keep talking about this enormous landslide and huge majority, but we know, we know that it's built on sand. We know that it is not as deep and as sort of hard a majority as it looks. And I think that's been the problem, because they've come in and people say, well, what have they done with this enormous majority? And they've tried to do various tough things at the beginning to try to get the finances back, to try to fill the black hole about which we can argue. And then, as Guto says, but they're doing it in a way that's really offending their core MPs, a lot of the core MPs who they need and who are quite happy, I think, to turn on the leadership, because a lot of those MPs know they're not going to be MPs in 4 years' time, because their majorities are very, very small. Their individual majorities are very small. And so I think the tail is wagging the dog a bit.
Tom, I know you want to speak up to some extent for the government. I know you're not the mouthpiece for them, but what is interesting is the way in which the backbenchers have behaved. What do you make of that?
I think in lots of ways this government is a victim of the success of the campaign which elected it. So it's constrained by some of the promises it made to get that big majority. You've also got a lot of MPs with very, very small majorities because they were so efficient at spreading the vote. So even in the target seats, I think there has been a problem about communications between Downing Street and backbenchers, and I think Downing Street are aware of that. They want to correct that. I think it can't be right that Keir Starmer still hasn't met some of his new MPs. That's not his fault. That's just like it just needs to be sorted out. And I think sometimes because of who Keir Starmer is, I think there's a lot to him. I've written a whole book about him. I don't think he's always particularly...
Available in all good bookshops?
Well, there's a new edition coming out this month, actually, fully updated with the story of the first year.
It's almost as if we scripted it.
Well, I mean, you can pre-order it now. I'm sure you already have. But look, there is a lot to like about this government. I think they've done some really good things. I think they're spending on the NHS, spending on infrastructure, the long-term stuff in terms of clean energy, the social housing, the minimum wage increases, the pay rises for key workers. I think that's all good. What I don't think they've done enough is join those dots together, join those bullet points together into a story. And I think the way you join those stories, those bullet points together, is through talking about values. We've just had Neil Kinnock on. There's no better storyteller of Labour values than Neil Kinnock. And I think we need a bit of that.
But don't you think the story has been all the U-turns? That's what most people have noticed, the sort of flip-flopping that Keir Starmer's become so sort of famous for or infamous for. And that's the thing that people think, you promised one thing and now you're doing another, and then you've promised the backbenchers that they wouldn't have to vote through lots of unpopular things, whether it's foreign aid or pensions or welfare bills or PIP or whatever it might be. And then when you get scared, you don't stand firm and you do a U-turn. It looks weak.
Well, I think we have this weird thing in politics. We sort of fetishise sort of toughness and intransigence.
I agree with that.
So I quite like having a Prime Minister who, when he gets something wrong, holds his hand up and says, yeah, I've made a mistake and we'll try a different way. And that's how he's always been. That's how he's always conducted himself.
But there's a huge difference.
Yeah, and I like that, and it's a brave position to take. But on this occasion, the U-turns have massive consequences. So for Labour to succeed in its mission, it needs to drive economic growth. The decision on national insurance on employers did a lot of damage to that, as well as a lot of briefing. To actually spend more on things you really care about and on working people, which Neil Kinnock reminded us was the plan and the core of Labour, not people who are not working, you have to reform welfare. And they've just bottled it now because the backbenchers cannot stomach it. And the story being told about the sense of purpose behind reforming welfare wasn't told strongly enough. So the backbenchers have just pulled the plug on that. And now that means not just, superficial consequences. It means you cannot now lift the child benefit cap. You cannot now spend more on education or defence or all kinds of other things. This is very, very real.
And then I want to show you something. I want to show you a word cloud. But
I think this comes back to how you tell the story. So I don't question their motives about how they, launched this welfare change, but it came across as a big, fat £5 billion cut. What you could have done is 3 or 4 months ago said, we need to reform welfare. There's a consensus of the party about doing it, but we're going to do it according to Labour values of addressing child poverty, ensuring that resources go to the people who need them most, and also trying to get people back to work and off benefits. If you'd done that, I think you'd have had a consensus of the Labour Party, but they haven't told the story through values, and they've bounced around on it. That's correctable, and they can find better ways of doing this, but they need to start doing it fast.
There's a lot of damage has been done.
Let's talk, and when we're talking about telling stories, there's storyteller, there's also listeners, and the listeners in this case are the electorate. And I think we can show a word cloud that has been created by the pollsters More in Common. They asked people, what would you say has been Labour's biggest achievement in government? Nothing.
Nothing. Yeah.
That's kind of evidence of it. Daisy?
Well, I mean, that doesn't come as a surprise at all. And I think Tom made a really valid point, which I wholeheartedly agree with him on, that we do fetishise, sticking to one story, and that we don't allow politicians to change their minds. And
people change their minds.
Well, we do. But I think it's really admirable, for instance, if a politician says, I used to be anti-gay marriage and now I've changed my mind. And we can all say, you've moved with the times and you understand. But those aren't the sort of ideological changes of mind that these politicians are talking about. This is just trying something and failing to get it through the backbenchers and then saying, I've changed my mind. That's not changing your mind. That's realising somebody else has told you what to do and you can't force them to do what you want them to do.
I used to think 300 billion was too much to spend on welfare when we spend a fraction of that on education and on defence and on infrastructure and all that kind of stuff. And now, because the backbenchers have pulled the plug on me, I actually think it's a good idea to spend 300 billion
and it's not true.
It leaves you with a great big hole and a horrible, horrible decision whether you ramp up taxes or find something else.
Well, the problem is that the government there's already a story in the public mind. There's the other half of this word cloud, asking what is it that people do remember from the government's first year, and I think we can see it here. It's only one thing: winter fuel allowance. So they've got to get past all of that, and I think this point about people changing their minds is fine if the electorate is willing to listen. It feels like it's not willing to listen at the moment. The question, let's talk about what they might do. if we like, to reset. And I was very struck by Neil Kinnock this morning. I didn't expect him to say this. Essentially, wealth taxes, taxes on assets. Do we all agree that there's going to be tax rises
Yes, 100%.
in the autumn?
I think that's what it looks like, yeah.
What do you think about this idea that Labour essentially says we are the party of essentially redistribution, and what we're going to do is redistribute some wealth from people who've got, you know, big, expensive houses or land or stocks and shares to other people?
I think that we always talk about the reaction of the city and the reaction of the markets, and again, that shouldn't be one of the tails that wags the dog, but I think it would go down like a lead balloon with financial markets. I think it would be very difficult for Labour, who spent so much time in the election reassuring business and reassuring markets that they were a safe pair of hands and they had their fiscal rules and so on and so forth, then to suddenly become a much more radical Labour government, I think would be a very, very difficult place. But taxes will have to go up, whether it's another fudge of keeping the, freezing the income rates where they were for yet another few years, which, isn't popular, but is a fudge that they could see. I think that would be easier for them. I don't believe that Rachel Reeves is going to be in her job, no matter what Keir Starmer says. I think they'll find a way to get rid of her, because that would make it easier to put taxes up, because it's not her, because whoever the Chancellor then is won't be the one who kept promising not to put taxes up.
No, I think Labour is a serious political party, and it's making serious choices and serious decisions about balancing the books, which the last Conservative government failed to do. Reform,
correct.
Absolute pie in the sky, not a serious political party at all. So there are going to be some serious choices made. I think Neil Kinnock's idea about wealth tax is interesting. And I mean, it's very difficult to do. This government is already doing some wealth taxes, by the way. I mean, they've done non-doms, they've done increases in capital gains, they've moved on inheritance tax for closing that loophole for farmers, large landowners. It's difficult to do, and it's often very unpopular. There are other things that you can do. I mean, there's, Gordon Brown talks a lot about taxing gambling.
Sin taxes, as they call them.
There's
smoking, bad things.
The revenues from
television.
Revenues from the banking tax have gone down from £8 billion to £3 billion, and their profits are up. There's also talk, I hear a bit in government about whether you can actually do a precept for defence. So look, the world has changed. There is, a fundamental reason why we need to spend more on defence, because we're in a very much more unstable
every taxpayer
world.
Basically has to pay an extra penny or something.
But there's lots of different ways. There's lots of different ways to do this.
All of this is missing the point that in any household, if you go back now and say we can't afford to go on holiday this year, you're not going to think about how I raise more money. You might think try and get a new job, but that's hard. You think, what can I rein in on? At the moment, the two things we spend most on is welfare and debt payments to sustain the massive spending that we spend on welfare. So you have to stop at some point and say, more tax is not the answer. And actually, wealth taxes, they sound great in terms of values. Let's punish the rich. What happens in a dynamic global economy now is when you tax the rich, they move somewhere else. And then you don't get any of their taxes. You don't get the philanthropy, the jobs, the investment that they do. And so you end up poorer again. And that's why this government at the moment is briefing, it seems, that they're going to rein back on the sort of assault on the super rich and the non-doms. You've got to address expenditure at some point.
Look, what a serious government does is it says if non-doms is actually revenue negative, then it's not really worth doing. Yeah. There are ways of taxing wealth which would be revenue positive, and I think they will make those serious decisions. But you just raised the example of what happens in a household, and if it can't do this, then it has to rain. That's what happens in real life. People don't call it a U-turn. They don't call it sort of, oh, you're weak because you're not going on holiday.
No, we're all agreeing.
The point is, when people change their mind in normal life, you take decisions.
We've got ourselves onto quite a good point here, because actually, let's talk about what they could do. And in fact, the clever guys who work with me have come up. I mean, they should be working with government, not for me. But anyway, they've come up with some rather interesting ways in which the government could actually save some of this money. And you said welfare and debt. Actually, the other big thing, of course, is pensions. We could do something about the triple lock. But here are some options, which I'll talk to Bridget Phillipson about a bit later. You could, and this is increasing taxes by 1%. Increase national insurance, 1%, 11 billion. VAT, put on 1%, you get 8 billion. Is this the sort of thing they ought to be considering, Daisy?
Well, we know what happened when national insurance employer contributions went up in the last budget, and that has done huge damage to a lot of businesses and has a lot of trickle-down effects, both to businesses, to inflation, to all sorts of issues that have come back to bite this government and the Bank of England. So I think that's a terrible idea. I think, and the other problem, I know we keep banging on about politicians changing their mind, but when politicians stand up and say to a general electorate in a general election, I promise I'm not going to put up taxes, then they're creating the problem for themselves. It wasn't, we didn't put those words in their mouth.
Is this the sort of thing you would have in mind?
Well, no, I think we've got to sort of address the expenditure. I don't want to see any of these things happen because they have really bad consequences. Corporation taxes, if you whack that up when the rest of the world are not, you're putting a sign on the White Cliffs of Dover saying Britain is not really interested in you coming here as investors. If you do basic income tax rates, you're punishing people, most of them are not very well off, who are really struggling, and resent people in the same neighbourhood who are on welfare paid for by this. If you do the other ones, national insurance costs, Daisy said it.
A second. Tom, just quickly, because I want to come back to all of you and talk to you about whether it's the measures or the man we need to be talking about. But
Look, you can't keep reaching for we just cut welfare. That's what the Tories said in the last election. We'll cut 10, 15 billion pounds from welfare. They were in government for 14 years. They failed to do it. They let welfare costs rise over and over again. And what you're seeing there is every one, apart from the top one, which they've already done, would be a breach of a manifesto pledge. That shows how difficult this is. Everything's been cut to the bone under the Tories already. We had 14 years of austerity. It's very difficult to cut any more. That's what we found with the disability benefit changes. It's really difficult, this. Breaking a manifesto pledge is going to be really difficult. There are some very, very tough decisions coming up.
OK, now, Mel's not quite ready for us. So actually, let me ask you, Tom, because you are closer in the sense to, you understand Sir Keir Starmer probably better than the rest of us, who've had more access. We've been talking about policy, we've been talking about the things that they could do, but what we were talking about earlier was the problem of getting the message across, and we saw the word clouds, clearly what the electorate is taking. How much of Labour's problem is the message, and how much of it is the messenger?
I think the messenger, if you're saying Keir Starmer,
correct,
can actually be someone who speaks for that big, tolerant, decent majority in this country. I think he understands Britain. He fits into the contours and the folds of this country better than most politicians I know. He's actually very normal in a way that most politicians are a bit abnormal, to tell the truth, right? The trouble is...
Being a virtue isn't necessarily... being normal is not necessarily a virtue in politics.
Well, you say that, Trevor.
It's very unusual,
But to be normal means actually you don't want to use your kids as props. You don't want to tell the world about your brothers dying from cancer. And that's a very normal human thing to do. The trouble is you then see a rather bland exterior. Now, the question for Keir, I think, is how can he connect that personality more to what he's doing? So, for instance, disability benefit changes. His mother was disabled. His brother was disabled. He didn't tell that story. He's actually lived much of his life knowing a lot about disability, but he didn't. It just sounded like he was just doing numbers. I think he needs to bring himself more into his message.
Let's carry on with this a bit later, but we have to talk to Mel Stride now. This time last year, the Conservatives were licking their wounds after the most disastrous general election result in their history. Since then, they've changed leaders, they've changed cabinet, and vowed to renew and rebuild. Well, let's see. How's that going? Let's talk to the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride. Good morning, Mr. Stride.
Good morning, Trevor.
Neil Kinnock has just been talking to us about what the government might do, and he's suggested that the government, it's in a jam, it might need to think about wealth taxes. What do you reckon?
I think it'd be the worst thing to do. We've already had far too many taxes on wealth creation. You look at national insurance, £25 billion burden carried by business, and that's a substantial part of the reason why the economy has not been growing in the way that it should. We've also seen around 10 to 15,000 high net worth individuals leave our country as a result of this government's policies. Now, some people, the socialists, might say, oh, well, who cares about that? Well, the problem is that the amount of tax that those people have been paying requires about 1/3 people on average earnings to cover that lost tax that's just gone straight out of the door. So the last thing we want to be doing now is piling further taxes on the wealth creators. We need to be, if anything, getting those taxes down and empowering them to go out and do what they do best, which is creating jobs and creating wealth and prosperity for our country.
All right. Is it right that you are going to propose that foreign nationals should be excluded from access to sickness benefits?
So we've tabled an amendment to the welfare bill that's going through Parliament at the moment, saying that we think the government should come through with a discussion paper on that issue and addressing this question as to whether foreign nationals should be receiving those kind of benefits. We know that, for example, over the last 3 years, the number of foreign nationals claiming these benefits has doubled, and we know that if you take those households with at least one foreign national within the household, the welfare bill is about £1 billion per month, so the numbers are very high. We would, of course, be excluding not just those that are British citizens, but those that have rights under international treaties to settle in the United Kingdom.
But just to be clear about that, I mean, why pick on them? I mean, foreign nationals pay taxes too, and why would they be particularly people that you'd want to say should be excluded from receiving benefits?
Well, under the existing arrangements,
I think
Trevor,
that something like a fifth or a third of people who work in the NHS would be foreign nationals. What's so special about them that means that they get punished?
So there are already particular arrangements around foreign nationals and their access to benefits. But look, I think at the heart of this, and we are calling for a discussion document, so there are lots of questions that we need to consider, including the one that you've just posed. But I think the point is that British citizenship should mean something. And I think most people would agree with the idea that, you know, if you are to benefit from our welfare state and health benefits and all sorts of other things, it's not unreasonable to expect that to be for those who have citizenship in our country. And of course, many foreign nationals can qualify for that, apply for it and achieve it in due course. But what we're calling for is a discussion document from the government to look at these issues.
So somebody who happens to have been born in London or Liverpool or Carlisle, but has never worked a day in their life, has access to sickness benefits. But somebody who may have come here and after 3 years has worked really hard, done 2 jobs and so on, after 2 or 3 years gets access to sickness benefits, they get taken out, do they?
So I think there is a principle here, Trevor, which is that I think citizenship should mean something, and I don't think it's unreasonable to have particular arrangements for those who are British citizens and citizens of our country. At the same time, as I say, the amendment is calling for the government to come forward with a discussion document, and there are many questions along the lines of those that you posed, indeed many others, that we'll need to consider. But I think the basic principle, though, is a strong and important one that I think most people would feel was reasonable.
Are you sure this is not just being a bit adjacent, reform adjacent, to make the people who are departing from you to reform feel that you're on their side, but you're never actually going to do it?
No, this is about getting a grip on the welfare bill. Now, when we were in power, we brought in reforms to the work capability assessment that the OBR themselves scored as saving £5 billion and would have seen 450,000 fewer people on those long-term sickness and disability benefits, according to the OBR, and those people then having the opportunity with support to go into the world of work. And that's what my party is about. We believe in work, and we believe that we should be there having a welfare system that encourages and incentivises work at every turn, and that's the approach that we have to welfare.
Your colleague Jeremy Hunt said to Sophie Ridge this week, we could do a lot worse than Rachel Reeves. After all the speculation about the Chancellor this week, are you glad to see that she's kept her job?
Well, I think if she's not to keep her job, then the Prime Minister needs to go as well, because he has been responsible for much of the chaos that we've seen in the last few weeks.
That isn't actually the question I asked.
Complete control. Well, sorry, you're asking me whether she should keep her
job.
Well, it's not for me to opine on who keeps it. Frankly, Trevor, I'd like to see all the Labour front bench step down, because I think we've had a year of utter underperformance. Whether you look at illegal boats, migrants coming across the Channel, that's now at record levels. Far from smashing the gangs, they're smashing all the records as to the numbers coming into our country. If you look at the chaotic U-turns that we've just had in the last few weeks.
I guess I'm putting it to you as a reasonable, non-tribal sort of bloke, that actually you think she's the best of a bad lot, don't you?
Well, look, I'm not going to start sort of saying whether she should come or go. I just think the whole government and the Chancellor is part of that. The Prime Minister is certainly very much part of it. Has been leading a pretty rudderless administration that has not got to grips with some of the serious challenges that we have as a country, has not delivered on the kind of growth that they were saying that they would do in the economy, has borrowed huge amounts of money, have stoked up inflation, kept interest rates higher for longer, is mounding up that national debt, and so on and so forth. And this is just a very, very poor track record. And I think you can point to several members of the front bench who really are not making the grade.
Can I ask you a question, which I suppose I would like you to answer as a parliamentarian rather than a spokesperson for your party. Was it right for Kemi Badenoch to draw attention to the Chancellor's distress in the House of Commons in the way that she did? It didn't particularly add to the political point she was making. And I wonder if this is a sort of, you know, going into the tackle studs up approach, which is making life difficult for Kemi Badenoch.
Well, no, I don't think there was anything personal in that moment at all. It was a typically sort of high-octane joust. She pointed at the Chancellor and said, look, she's miserable. Well, no, well, I think we are all agreed, and I actually messaged Rachel shortly after that PMQs to say that I felt for her and I hope that she was OK, because I think at a personal level, that's what most people, of course, would rightly feel. But at the same time,
has your leader apologised?
Hold on, Trevor. I've got to finish your question. I've got to finish your question, which is that you know, her job, her duty at that point is to be up at the dispatch box, holding the Prime Minister to account. And bear in mind, this is a week in which they've had to step back from £5 billion worth of welfare reforms. Now, that's an unfunded commitment, along with the U-turn that they had on winter fuel payments. They're up to about £6 billion of unfunded commitments. They said they would never do that. Yet another broken promise. And we're all going to pay for it by way of higher taxes in the autumn. And they're already taxing us enough, and it's damaging the economy. And I think under those circumstances, it's not surprising that she's up there vociferously holding Keir Starmer to account.
Do you happen to know if she's reached out to the Chancellor at a personal level and maybe apologised, maybe said, I feel for you?
No, I don't. All I know is what I've done, which, as I say, I did message Rachel shortly after PMQs just to say, firstly, that I felt for her, and secondly, to say that I hope that she was OK.
Mel Stride, thank you so much for your time this morning. In just a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
Live here from Washington.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place. And all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
Turkey is burying its dead. Whole families died in this collapse. Generations wiped out. I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Berlin. This is just a small sample of the deadly arsenal taken off the streets.
Anyone could say, I'll do that, and then have to go and shoot someone.
Yes.
Sky News. Get the full story first.
I'm Stephen Murphy, and I'm Sky's Ireland correspondent based here in Dublin.
The waters of Ireland and Britain should be home to great white sharks.
If there are great white sharks in this area, there's no reason they wouldn't come here to feed. It's basically a buffet on a beach. This could be not only a record-breaking storm, but potentially the most dangerous storm ever to hit Ireland.
Turkey is burying its dead. Whole families died in this collapse. Generations wiped out.
I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Berlin.
This is just a small sample of the deadly arsenal taken off the streets.
Anyone could say, I'll do that, and then have to go and shoot someone.
Yes.
Sky News. Get the full story first.
Right, back to our panel. Tom Baldwin, Daisy McAndrew and Guto Harry. Guto, what do you think? This issue of, is it the message or the messenger?
Well, the two are linked, and I think Tom was saying just beforehand that you need to see a little of the character and the texture of the man. And, you know, I don't think politicians should be exploiting their families and their friends and all that, but their backstory is relevant because it says more about how they take decisions and how they react to the things that were unknowns when we all voted for them than any sort of manifesto that's been drafted by people other than them. And he hasn't shown a lot of himself. And I think people like me have seen him in the Oval Office dealing with a bat-crazy situation with the US president and kind of admired how he handled that, but haven't seen that sort of in other walks of life. And so I think a little bit more texture and context and personality would help. But I come back again. There are decisions that bravely, and I cheered them on a year ago when they're prepared to grapple with big, difficult decisions. A year on...
You did, in fact, say so on this programme.
I did so, didn't I? And so I did wish them well as well. I wanted to see the government who's going to be in power for 5 years succeed. But a year on, the sort of where we've ended up is genuinely a mess. And I say that sincerely.
I think you're absolutely right. And I also applauded the government when they came in and seemed to want to grasp the nettle on some of these tricky issues, things, and you have to do that at the beginning of a government. You can't wait until the end of a parliament before you start making some unpopular decisions because it's too near to the election. So that was all good, and particularly things like, you know, wanting to really boost housing, you know, boost the number of houses, but all those things. But a lot of these things are going to fail by their own metrics. Some of it their own fault for U-turning, some of it not necessarily their own fault. But the messenger and the message, I don't necessarily agree with Tom that Keir Starmer didn't talk about his background. I mean, we all used to groan every time he yet again talked about the toolmaker's son and so on. But the problem is that figures like Farage and Boris Johnson are very popular because they do show us exactly who they are, and people think this is a man I could have a pint with.
Or at least they show us a persona that we can...
Exactly.
Let's... it's been a rough year for the government, but of course it's also been rather an unpleasant year for Her Majesty's opposition. I think we can show you the polo coaster in a second, but it is really not good news. And it is particularly not good news... oh no, this is a coalition. This is the coalition graph that we'll come to in a moment. Actually, let's deal with this first. The polling at the moment shows us something quite striking. It looks as though on the current figures, it's going to be quite difficult. It would be quite difficult to assemble a government. YouGov have done this poll that tells us what the raw figures would translate to in seats. So you can see, at the moment, the Reform Party would be short of a majority. So how would they get to a majority? Well, one way would be to add votes from another party. The Conservatives would be the most likely. But even if they added the seats that Conservatives notionally would get, they wouldn't get to a majority. So who else could they get into their tent? They could add Lib Dems. Well, how likely do we think that is? Let's park that for 1 second. Let's think about what would happen if, Labour tried to put together a coalition. Yeah, you could imagine Labour-Lib Dem coalition. We've been there. But they're still short. So who would they add? Well, maybe the Tories might get patriotic and say, oh, we'll support the government one way or another. But they still wouldn't have a majority. They would need to add our friends in the north. Now, the point I'm really trying to make here is that on the current polling, it's inconceivable that we could have a single majority government or even a stable coalition. We're in very different territory now. I know we're going to say it's 3 years away, but this is something new, isn't it?
Yeah. Look, you're right to put that caveat in on current polling, because I think there are some underlying factors there. For instance, if you ask voters, who do you think would make the best Prime Minister? Again and again and again, Keir Starmer wins by quite a large margin, despite you saying, oh, everyone prefers the idea of going for a pint with Nigel Farage, even though he actually drinks red wine in pubs, not beer. Now, the point is this, that when voters go into the ballot box to pick a government, a serious government, ready to make serious decisions, Farage won't tell you how he's going to pay for anything. It's pie in the sky. The Tory.
I'll pick you up on one small technical point, Tom. You're correct that if you put the net favourability ratings for Badenoch or Starmer or Farage together, Starmer wins. But he doesn't win if you look at how many people want that person. Farage suffers because a lot of people dislike him, but actually more people like him than like Starmer or Badenoch.
But this is important. So Keir Starmer said to me in the interview I did with The Observer last weekend that he wants to fight Farage, fight this right-wing populist Trumpian party in this country as Labour, as a progressive party. He wants to rebuild that progressive coalition against the rise of right-wing populism. That, I think, is going to be the choice in the next election, and it's really important you start doing it now.
I think a lot of politicians think that we're back where we were in the sort of 80s and 90s, where we did have two main big parties, and most people might do a protest vote mid-Parliament for the Lib Dems or whoever it might be, and then they would come back to the fold for the general election. I really sincerely believe those days are over for now. Maybe they'll come back in 5 or 10 years, but people now are prepared to say, to hell with you, I'm going to vote for Brexit, I'm going to vote for reform, I'm going to change. And, well, it doesn't matter how it worked out. The fact is that people are prepared to vote in ways that they simply weren't when we all used to be told basically by our dads how to vote. Those days are gone. And I think Neil Kinnock made a really interesting point to you about PR and voting reform, that I think that those graphs that you were showing do show why maybe we will one day end up with voting reform.
Good. Let me just put one more to you, which is I think we can now summon up the polar coast. I hope we can summon it up. But what it shows us is that the Tories have fallen behind, even behind where they were last July at the election. And the thing that is very striking, you can probably, I'm not sure if we've got the line here, but you can see where things go particularly badly for them. They started to fall off, actually, after you got your new leader. We've been talking about whether Starmer's the problem or the message Labour's the problem. Is the Tory problem the leader?
Well, a lot of people don't like hearing it, but the Tory direction of travel has gone south since they toppled Boris Johnson. It's gone south dramatically with Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak, despite being a decent and capable guy who did a lot of good, actually never sealed any deal with the electorate. And then I don't think Kemi Badenoch, to put it politely, has had much impact.
Well, you can see, if you look at November, look at the dark blue line, that's where your peak was at November, which is when she got elected, and it's all been pretty smoothly downhill after that.
Yeah, and it's not great. But I think, I don't think Kemi Badenoch appreciates, nor does Keir Starmer appreciate, that they're not looking at this coalition polar coaster thing in 3 years' time. This is going to happen in Wales next year. There's going to be an election, and the outcome, I would bet now, is going to be inconclusive, but with a real option of reform, if they were backed by the Conservatives, actually throwing Labour out for the first time in the history of devolved administration in Wales. Even if Labour join forces with what's left of the Lib Dems, but more importantly, Plaid Cymru, that is the race, whether you get that coalition of the left or that coalition of the right. But the battle largely is over between Reform and the Conservatives. The Conservatives in Wales will be lucky to hang on to what they have. Reform are now going for Labour. And so this is going to be a huge contest. And when it happens in Wales, it will set the scene for what will happen in Westminster in 2 years' time. So the clock is ticking very, very fast.
Tom, I was very interested. You said a moment ago that essentially Starmer is going to have to see Farage as his main opposition. That is, in many people's views, a really rather remarkable thing. A party that didn't really exist a couple of years ago has suddenly become the alternative. I mean, we can scoff at the polls and all the rest of it, but isn't it something of a defeat for the government to have to admit that these people have become actually the real opposition?
Look, the electorate's incredibly volatile and politics is very febrile and the polls are swinging all over the place. I don't know whether the Conservative Party can come back or not. It's been written off before and it has come back. What I do know is that the sooner we start treating Farage and this sort of Trumpian populist party he represents seriously, the sooner they're exposed as not a serious party, right? They've got some policies. Well, let's see how they're going to pay for them. Let's see how they actually would take the tough decisions. Because at the moment, they're in the position of a kind of protest party plus something, a sort of angry party. That's very different to actually having to consider what you are doing in government. And if you expose them to that kind of scrutiny and light and start taking them seriously, I think you see a very, very unserious bunch of charlatans.
Well, I think it's a bit unfair. I mean, Mr Farage has actually got some policies. He's for the winter fuel allowance. He is talking about... He actually wants some taxes on the rich. He supports some aspects of the employment rights bill. I mean, they are getting some definition, aren't they?
I was in a TV studio with one of his representatives the other day, his Sky studio. I said, he was going, we need to make some welfare cuts. I said, which do you cut? Oh, I don't know, he said. I mean, it's just a joke. And then he started making jokes. He started making jokes about toilets and things. It's just, I mean...
But Tom, you can't have it both ways. You can't say that Starmer's now taking them seriously, and now there's a fourth time you've said in this conversation they're a joke. You can't have it both ways. Either they're serious or they're not.
No, I think we should take them seriously. That doesn't mean they're a serious party. The more we take them seriously, the more we expose them as unserious.
OK.
Well, I've thought all along that Nigel Farage offers seemingly simple solutions to extremely complex problems, and the odds of them working are always sort of remote. And we've seen it with Trump. Whatever you think of, a whole range of things, he genuinely thought that you could save trillions in government, and he brought in Elon Musk with a chainsaw to do it. And what's he doing at the moment? No, he's given up on that very, very quickly, and he's actually piling on the debt. And that's why Elon Musk is starting a new party. And so I think there is a serious question of Whether you like the mood music, the look and feel, I don't, because I don't like the sort of, anti-immigrant sort of obsession of it. But they do have a chance now to prove what they can do. And that will call them out. That will expose them. It's the right word, whether they are real or whether they're not.
Well, look, I'm going to have to thank you all. This has been fantastic this morning. As viewers will have grasped, we have had to move things around quite a lot today for technical reasons. One of our studios has gone out. But thank you very much for bearing with us. I'm now going to talk to Lord Coe. In the humid heat of Singapore exactly 20 years ago, the 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games were awarded to London. Inspire a generation was the slogan for that brilliant summer of sport. A summer I'm sure that pretty much all of us can remember in our own way. Now, Sebastian Coe is the president of World Athletics, and he was the mastermind behind the Games, and he joins us now from Silverstone. Good morning, Lord Coe.
A very wet Silverstone. Good morning.
Is it? Oh, wow, OK. I hope they've got the safety car out.
They have, actually.
Going back to that day, that July in now 20 years ago, what's your standout memory?
Oh, I think it was the closeness of the result. I mean, we snuck across the line with 4 votes in 104. We talk about elections, we talk about marginality. That's about as close an election as I'll ever fight. And we got across the line in large part because of the people of the UK that came in behind us. And the momentum towards the vote itself was palpably growing, but it was uncertain right up to the last moment. So I think it was really just the enormity of what we achieved that day, but then the recognition that for the next 7 years we were really going to have our work cut out to deliver something that made the country proud and did leave a lasting legacy.
What was our edge, do you think?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
What was our edge?
I think in any campaign you look back and you think you want to make less. In a way, I know this sounds slightly pessimistic, but you want to make less mistakes than the opposition teams. And I think the consistency of our message, the fact that we really identified not just how we were going to do what we did, but why we were doing it. The articulation around what we could do in East London, for instance, a desolate parcel of land, 520 hectares, that when we started the bidding process was really badly underdeveloped. London's economy had left it largely untouched for a long time. And I think being able to articulate why we wanted to do what we wanted to do, the change to the landscape, that you've only got to go to that land now in East London to see the 3 universities, the Sadler's Wells, the Tate, the Westfield Shopping Centre, and home, of course, to thousands of people. We built, I think, the articulation around building a new city inside an old city in 7 years, and with timelines that were immutable. You couldn't just suddenly say, well, we want to move the opening ceremony a few days because we haven't quite finished the stadium. And I also think, for me, I guess as a former jobbing politician, the key element in all that was, for the first time and for a long time, this was a really politically bipartisan project. Good opposition spokespeople became really well-versed, good ministers. And Tessa Jowell, who we owe so much to, who was in large part the driving force behind the then government to back the bid, actually seamlessly became a really supportive opposition spokesman. And I think it left people with comfort that this didn't become a political football. And if I may say so, I think there are some very big issues that the United Kingdom faces that the London Games proved a really good blueprint for, and maybe, the delivery of healthcare could be looked at in exactly that bipartisan way.
Well, I want to ask you, about the current situation. I think you were slightly more than a jobbing politician, actually. I think at one point you could have been Mayor of London. And I wonder if you think that we could do this now. We could have that bipartisan approach. We could bring people together in that same way.
I would like to be able to answer that question with a resounding yes. I'm not so sure. I think the world of politics, particularly domestically, has changed. And I'm not sure really for the better. But I do think that if you have a project, and remember, Trevor, when I was busily telling everybody, don't worry, we can manage this, it was set against a backdrop of hardly unalloyed joy around the delivery of the dome. Wembley, changed its spec about 6 or 7 times. I think, in large part, if you have a project and you're prepared to articulate it and you're prepared to discuss it openly and take people with you, I think you can get that bipartisan approach. But at the moment, some of these bigger issues do seem to get bogged down into sort of tribal positions, and that never happened during the London years. And I think it's a personal observation, I know, but I think it's a pretty good benchmark.
So I know it's very noisy out there, but let's persevere for a little bit longer, because there's a couple of things I want to ask you about. You are a big figure on the global sports stage now. One of the things that a lot of people in your world are talking about is Mr. Trump's travel ban on countries like Afghanistan, Cuba, Venezuela. What impact is that going to have on international sports, particularly athletics?
Look, I think we accept that we talked about this being the 20th anniversary of the London bid. I think we accept, even though the landscape was pretty complicated then, we had boots on the ground in the Gulf, and it was a complicated landscape. I think we accept globally, particularly at this moment, it's probably about as complicated as it has been, and particularly in the world of sport. Look, travel bans around whether it's about visas or whether it's been about the length of stay is not an unusual issue, and America is not the only country that has implemented that. Interestingly, the first big test for that globally will be next year, because World Athletics has its World Cross Country Championships in Tallahassee, Florida. And already we are working with various agencies in the US to make sure that we get the athletes that are eligible to compete there, and that there does need to be some derogation. And look, this isn't an unusual landscape, and America, as I've said, is certainly not the only one. But we will work our way through this, and it's now just one of the bigger challenges that organisations like World Athletics and FIFA and the International Olympic Committee have to confront.
Can I just very briefly bring you back to the legacy of 2012? And part of the legacy was, as you were saying, the infrastructure. But another part of the legacy was supposed to be the nation's health. Recently, we hear that a quarter of primary school children leave school and they leave primary school and they are obese. These are children who have been born since 2012. Isn't that a scandal?
It's a multifaceted problem, and the problem we have, and it's a large part, it's a political problem. We tend to see obesity as being purely a health issue. It isn't. It's about tax and spend. It's about good healthcare policies, obviously, but it is actually also about having good sports policies. It's about funding youth programs properly. And yes, we set out with a very clear ambition. It was to inspire a generation. More people are actually now running, more people are cycling, more people are doing many of the sports that have an endurance and aerobic capacity. But yes, you're right, the challenge, and it's a growing challenge. I was with the Indian Prime Minister only a few months ago. We talked about fragilities and challenges and global politics. And the thing that really focused him was how does he get a generation of young people into programs of physicality. So I think London did something that actually managed to stem the flow. Up until that point, we were really hemorrhaging participation. It has at least stabilised, but no, Trevor, you're right, it is the biggest challenge. Between the age of 8 and 12, the average child in the UK becomes 50% less active. And that is not just a health issue, that is something governments have to see as a cross-cutting issue.
I'm sorry, Lord Coe, we're going to have to wrap there. So good to talk to you. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Right, let's go to our government now. I can speak to the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson. Good morning, Secretary of State.
Hello, good morning.
We've been talking school reports this morning. I gather in these days children are asked to rate themselves. What rating are you going to give your own government?
That's a tough one. I'm not the biggest fan of doing it in that way. Look, I think we've done some great things.
But anyway, I'm going to ask you anyway.
No. Well, and I'm not going to answer it, I'm afraid. But we've done some great things, but there's clearly more that we need to do. And, you know, we hear from voters that they really want to see the change that they voted for delivered in their lives. I think we've done some brilliant things so far in the first year. In education, for example, new free breakfast clubs, expanding childcare, expanding free school meal support to more and more children. And what I'm talking about today around Best Start family hubs that will build on the proud legacy of Sure Start and will revitalise family support services right across our country.
All right, well, look, I know, I gather you don't want to give yourself a grade out. I don't know why, but anyway. But you could at least say whether you would agree with what appeared on so many school reports that I remember could do better.
Yeah, of course we could. I mean, you know, government has its ups and downs. We haven't got everything right. I think there's clearly things that we need to consider, particularly from the last week in particular. But we are driving forward change in so many areas that would simply not come with a Conservative or Reform government. So take what I'm setting out today, £500 million of investment to bring together family support services with health services and making sure that parents get more support at the earliest point in their child's life. I said when I became Education Secretary that early years would be my #1 priority, and I'm delivering on that. Is there more to do? Absolutely, I'd be the first to acknowledge that.
OK, well, let's talk about what you might have to do. After your surrender this week on welfare benefits, Chancellor is £5 billion short. To keep our education metaphor going, this is math class. She's £5 billion short on the calculations she made on the spending review. She is going to have to raise taxes, isn't she?
Look, as you'll appreciate, these are matters for the Chancellor to set out at the budget. But yes, you know, we have been clear that the decision that we've taken in the last, the decision we've taken in the last week has come at a cost. Yes, and the fiscal rules that we have matter. They matter in terms of economic stability and providing that strong basis for growth. We are seeing green shoots. Of course, we see record levels of business confidence. We see more jobs being created, and we've seen interest rates come down. So those are all big and important changes. But absolutely, getting growth going is the biggest way that we can make sure that we do seek to break that link that we've seen in the past around tax and spend. And
what I am not hearing you say is what you have been saying to me for the last couple of years, that there will be no tax rises on working people.
We take our manifesto commitment seriously, of course we do, around making sure that working people are better off. That's something we've been focused on right across government. It's why, you know, with free school meals expansion, parents on universal credit will see £500 per child per year, that money back in their pocket. It's why we're cutting uniform costs. It's why we're expanding new free breakfast clubs. It's why parents will save £7,500 a year with our childcare expansion in the early years. So they are all designed to make working people better off. But issues of tax policy, wider fiscal choices, you will appreciate are matters for the Chancellor to take together as a package at the next budget.
Oh, well, I'll give it one last go. One option for that budget would be increases in taxes, either on businesses or on incomes, or possibly, as Lord Kinnock suggested this morning, on wealth. There could be tax rises.
I'm the Education Secretary, not the Chancellor. I'm afraid it's more than my job's worth to come on your show and speculate on what the decisions that the Chancellor may or may not take at a future fiscal event. There will be a budget in the usual way, and that's where she will set out our priorities at that point. We've, of course, just already had a spending review, and at that spending review have invested in transport infrastructure to get our economy moving, to support business growth and development, including in places like the North and the Midlands. We're investing more in education, more in skills, more support for our young people. Those will make a real difference. But future events, that's for another day.
All right, well, you say that, but the reason I'm asking you this is that as far as we understand it, and you can clear this up for us, the government is categorical that it will not raise or abolish the two-child cap on benefits. What is the intention there? Is that open for change, or is that actually a closed book?
So together with the Work and Pensions Secretary, Liz Kendall, I'm leading the Child Poverty Task Force. And what we're looking at is every way that we can lift more children out of poverty. It is the moral mission of this Labour government to make sure that where you're from doesn't determine what you can go on to achieve. And too many children in our country right now grow up in poverty, and we're determined to change that. But we're not waiting around for that. We've already expanded free school meals eligibility. I have also always been clear, as has Liz Kendall, that through the work that we're doing, we will look at measures in the security system as well as every way we can lift children out of poverty. But I've also been consistent in saying that any change like that does, of course, come with a big cost. And we have to do any change in policy, any change of any description, we have to be clear about how we're paying for that and how that's going to be delivered.
OK, just to be clear then, for families like the one that you yourself grew up in, poor families, it is still possible that at some point this government will want to lift the two-child cap, which is a step that many of your colleagues on the backbenches who've essentially had their victory this week think is the best way of dealing with the problems you've just been enumerating. It is still possible.
Of course, I've heard what they've got to say. Of course, I've heard what they've got to say. I've heard what charities and others have to say on the topic too. But they will appreciate, as we all do, that any change we set out in this area or in any other area, we've got to be clear about what the cost is and how we make sure that the numbers add up. And that's the job of the Chancellor to do that at the budget. And our fiscal rules do matter for economic stability, for business growth and development. But of course, as part of the work that we're doing through the Child Poverty Task Force, we are considering all of the ways in which we can make sure that we have a fairer and more equal society and a country where children are not scarred by child poverty. It is appalling how many children right now grow up in poverty. We are determined to bring those numbers down and to deliver better life chances for children. And today, what I'm setting out around our Best Start family hubs is also about making sure families have got the support they need, alongside that massive expansion of free school meals eligibility.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but because of today, we've been slightly short of time. But just to be absolutely clear, what are you saying to those backbenchers who have already been saying this week that the next thing they want the government to do, and they specifically want the Chancellor to say in her budget in the autumn, is that this government will lift the two-child cap on benefits? What are you saying to those backbenchers? Are you saying it's possible, or are you saying, look, this just you've shot that one, it's not possible, we don't have the money?
Look, the changes in the last week, of course, have come at a cost, and we have been upfront about that. But my message to my colleagues, to parents, to campaigners and to everybody watching this morning is that this Labour government is serious about tackling child poverty. We've demonstrated our intent already on that with the expansion of free school meals to all families in receipt of universal credit. We've demonstrated that with new free breakfast clubs. We've demonstrated that with expanding childcare support. This is a government that is focused on child poverty, that is focused on making sure that all children in our country are able to achieve and to thrive, and that will continue to be our position.
Just very quickly, 20 seconds so we've got. Are you being kept awake at night by the threat of a Corbyn-led party?
I mean, that's for them. And I think, obviously Jeremy Corbyn left the Labour Party some time ago. What keeps me up awake at night, if you like, and I sleep pretty well usually, but is making sure that we're just getting on and delivering the change that people voted for. I'm focused on that. That's the purpose of this government, delivering Labour values in action and making people feel better off.
Bridget Phillipson, thank you so much for your time this morning. That is it from us for this week. I'll be back next Sunday, 08:30 in the morning.
Our app gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
Live here from Washington.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place. And all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
Turkey is burying its dead. Whole families died in this collapse. Generations wiped out.
I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Berlin.
This is just a small sample of the deadly arsenal taken off the streets.
Anyone could say, I'll do that, and then have to go and shoot someone.
Yes.
Sky News. Get the full story first.